Welcome to this latest Fathom interview. I'm Jack Omer-Jackaman, Deputy Editor, and with me is Editor Alan Johnson, and we're delighted to be joined by Gershon Baskin. Gershon is a renowned writer and peace activist. He's a veteran of multiple Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, including the Oslo and Camp David processes, as well as the negotiations which saw the release of Gilad Shalit. Gershon, welcome.
Thank you.
You wrote a piece recently for the Times of Israel, co-authored with Samar Sinijlawi, a Palestinian political activist, entitled "The Necessary Peace, the Peace of No Choice." We're going to talk mainly about that article today, but before we get to that, I wonder, given the events of recent weeks, if you'd share with us some of your experience of kind of balance between security considerations and hostage release that might have been going on behind the scenes in recent weeks.
I think the main question that we're facing today, 9 weeks, I think it is, into the war, is the question of the hostages and whether or not they are the priority for the government of Israel, or the war effort is the priority. Which comes first, destroying Hamas, dismantling Hamas's ability to govern Gaza and threaten Israel and kill its leaders, or does bringing home the hostages come first? There is a statement being made by the government of Israel, supported by most of the military people, that the military pressure on Hamas works in the effort to bring the hostages home. I don't agree. And there's almost no one challenging this axiomatic statement that's being made by the government of Israel. I think it endangers the hostages. I think it puts them at risk every day that they are in Gaza. I think that we have seen a hardening of the Hamas position when there was an opportunity to continue the negotiations when the ceasefire or the pause was in place. Yes, it's true that Hamas was raising the price. Yes, it's true that Hamas didn't deliver all the young women that it said it would, but the door to negotiations were open then. And since the war effort has been renewed, the statement of Hamas is that they will not open negotiations until the war is ended permanently, which in Hamas's vision means that they're still in place governing in Gaza. The international pressure will mount on Israel, and they will still be holding 137 or 138 hostages, many of them soldiers, many of them senior citizens, many of them young women. And this is an intolerable situation. I think that the state of Israel has a moral responsibility to bring back the people that it allowed to be captured, that it allowed to cross our border. It failed to protect our people, our citizens, our border. And the government of Israel's first moral responsibility is to bring those hostages home.
Thank you, Gershon. Alan's going to ask a question now.
Okay. Gershon, I think we could probably talk about your answer for the rest of the interview, and I'm thinking maybe we should have you back on to do exactly that with another one. But what we've kind of got prepared today is a probing of your article in terms of Israel. So that's what we'll proceed with. But I think we should maybe talk after the interview about bringing you back on. So you wrote in the article with your Palestinian partner. Quote, "Here is what we can totally agree on, the we is you and your partner. At the end of this horrible war, there must be a new reality created where Palestinians and Israelis are forced to make arrangements that will put an end to the possibility of future wars." So interested in the language of forcing and international forcing, and what you had in mind by something that seems other than a voluntary agreement between the two parties, or at least solely that. What is this notion of international pressure or forcing, and why is it necessary?
Right. The basic idea is twofold. One is that just as this war is a war of no choice, we had to fight this war. We had no choice. The peace that we have to make is also a peace of no choice. We cannot leave it to our politicians who have failed us so badly, both Israeli and Palestinian, over decades, to trust that they will lead us to a different path. If we want to defeat Hamas, which is what we want to do, it's not only a military defeat. Israel, I hope, can defeat Hamas militarily. I hope that we can destroy the organization, their infrastructure, their weapons, and kill their leaders militarily and politically. But the idea of Hamas will remain in place as long as the Palestinian issue burns heavy in the hearts and minds of millions of Palestinians. It will probably go stronger after this war when the Palestinians are experiencing a Nakba. There's no way of describing what's happening in Gaza other than another catastrophe for the Palestinian people. And this has been brought on by their leaders. There's no question about that. But we are going to be faced with a reality once again where the Palestinians and the Israelis are going to have to make a choice. Are we simply adding another chapter to our collective memories, which force us to continue to look backwards as we've done over the last 100 years? Or are we going to be able to look forward and grasp with the reality that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are 7 million Palestinian Arabs and 7 million Israeli Jews, and that reality where one side controls the other or one side has more power over the other is not acceptable anymore. The Palestinians, in order to replace Hamas, have to have the ability to stop sanctifying death. They have to begin to sanctify life. They have to understand that they can live for Palestine, not only die for Palestine. And in order for that to happen, the reality of Palestine needs to be in front of them, which means that countries like the United Kingdom and the United States and the other major OECD countries have to recognize the state of Palestine. They can do it contingently. They can say after the Palestinian Authority conducts reforms, after they hold democratic elections, they can fence in those elections by not allowing any party that supports the armed struggle to compete in those elections. But it has to be done in a way that the Palestinian people no longer see a 30-year peace process with no end in sight, but that the Palestinian state becomes a reality in front of their eyes. Even if they don't have full control over the territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and eventually East Jerusalem as their capital, they have to know that this time the world is serious. We have to stop allowing people to say two-state solution when they only recognize one of those states.
Thank you, Gershon. I mean, that's another connected element to reach that kind of state that you're talking about, as you write in the article, is when you say, quote, the leaders of Israel and of Palestine must be replaced. They're directly responsible for where we are and how we got here. And we both need new leaders more connected to the people, with greater legitimacy and a commitment to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a first priority. Two kinds of questions might arise. What kind of new leaders are needed? Can you describe those leaders and perhaps locate them for us in Israeli and Palestinian civil society? And how do you envisage that change of leadership coming about? How's it going to happen?
I think in the question of how it's going to come about is that after the war, there's going to be a day of reckoning for the leaders of Israel who brought us to where they are, and they're going to be forced to pay the price for their failures. And I want to assert that the failures are not October 7th. The failures are everything that brought us to October 7th. The misconception that we can occupy another people for 56 years and expect to have peace, or to lock 2 million people, more than 2 million people in a territory like Gaza with 80% poverty and nowhere to go and expect to have quiet. The kind of ideology that enabled most of the army to be stationed in the occupied West Bank, protecting settlers instead of protecting Israel's borders. Those are the conceptualization failures that the government is going to need to face. And I believe that the people of Israel will make them face those realities. So they will be out. We may have an interim generation of leaders, of people who are there today, who are maybe thought to be more responsible, people like Gantz, maybe, people like Eisenkot, maybe some others on the current political scene, but I also don't believe that they have a long-term future as leaders. There will be a new generation of younger Israelis who will, maybe they come from the protest movement that ran for 40 weeks, maybe from other places, but a new generation of Israelis who understand that we have to stop lying to ourselves about being the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, when in fact we are not, as long as the current situation continues. And the Palestinians, I have no doubt, they want to get rid of their leaders today. They have wanted to get rid of Mahmoud Abbas for a long time. He's in the 18th year of a 4-year term. He's 87 or 88 years old, and people want to get rid of him a long time ago. I don't know who they will elect, but there will be a new generation of Palestinian leaders as well. Maybe they will select someone like Marwan Barghouti, who's in his 22nd year of imprisonment for leading the Second Intifada. That's going to be their choice. I would hope that they will select a leader who is willing to look forward and understand that they too need to recognize Israel's right to exist, that they need to recognize that the 7 million Israeli Jews who are living between the river and the sea have a right to be here, not our mere existence. The statement that I've been calling for is that it's time for us to recognize that all of us here have the same right to the same rights. And that's the foundation principle on which we will need to build and look forward. And I hope that the younger generation of Israelis and Palestinians will realize that. It'll be a great challenge. But the distance from where we are today to where we need to be is not time, it's leadership. It's those kind of people who will stand up and point us forward and not always looking backwards to what they have done to us. There's no doubt that we have plenty to blame each other for, Israelis and Palestinians, but we need to face the reality that we also have to figure out how we're going to share this land. And there's no better solution to do it than a two-state solution. That is also becoming real. For the last years, I thought it was no longer viable. I thought it was off the table. And suddenly, after October 7th, it's back on the table in real time, and everyone's talking about it. I'm invited to the UK. I think in February, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament is going to be holding a session on the two-state solution, and they've invited me to come and talk to the Parliament. I'm talking to ministers in the government of the UK and to people in the US government and other governments about how we can move this forward. We have to give hope of a real solution, no longer a naive kind of hope of that Oslo was built on. We have to learn the lessons of the failures. We have to understand that we go into this process not trusting each other, and we have to build the kind of peace accords which are based on a lack of trust, not on an assumption that there will be trust. We need to protect ourselves, not to make the failures that we did in the past. And I can go into some of those lessons learned or lessons that we need to learn before we move forward.
Thank you, Gershon. We'll come back to those shortly. Another component of your argument in print is concerns connection. You write, the strategy of the isolation of Gaza has only brought destruction to Palestinians. We need to connect Gaza to the West Bank and with the rest of the world and offer Palestinians again a path to a political development. How would you respond to those who might counter that those policies of disconnection were also what prevented Hamas, say, from perpetrating more October 7th? Was there ever an alternative to isolating Gaza once Hamas took over and turned it into a base to attack Israel? How would you respond to those kind of counter arguments?
The original conceptualization of the idea of isolating Gaza was that we're talking about 2007, 2008, 2009, a period of time when Salam Fayad was brought in to be prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. The international community came to the conclusion that the work of Salam Fayad had succeeded in making Palestine ready to assume the responsibilities of statehood. So the idea of isolation was to demonstrate to the Palestinian people that on the one side in the West Bank, you have a responsible government administration that is moving forward on making peace with Israel and seeking liberation and economic development, while on the other hand, the leadership that you chose to rule Gaza is destroying your chances of peace and prosperity and freedom. That was a great idea if the reality of peacemaking in the West Bank was real. But it wasn't, because when Netanyahu came back to power in 2009, his strategy was very clear: to delegitimize the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of its own people, to weaken the rule of Mahmoud Abbas, to reject every offer that Mahmoud Abbas made to enter into direct secret back-channel negotiations, while at the same time leaving an empowered, weakened Hamas in government in Gaza, so that Netanyahu could say to the people of Israel and the world, we want peace. He made his famous Bar Ilan speech in which he talked about a two-state solution. In parentheses, his father spoke the next day on Galei Tzahal, on Israel Army Radio, and he was asked, what do you think of your son's speech, in which he talked about a two-state solution? And Netanyahu's father responded, I know my son. He didn't mean it. And he did know his son. He didn't mean it. What he wanted to say is that we want peace, but who do you want us to negotiate with? The Holocaust deniers, the people who support terrorism in the West Bank, or the Hamas who wants to destroy us? And Netanyahu, this is now documented in the New York Times article this week, strengthened Hamas, enabled Hamas to get funding, enabled Hamas to stay in power. After every round of warfare with Hamas, The military and other people in the political arena said we have to dismantle Hamas, we have to destroy them. Hamas was very clear in knowing that those were empty statements. There was no intention of getting rid of Hamas. Having them there was very comfortable if you want to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel, if you reject the two-state solution. And that's what Netanyahu succeeded doing. Not only did he remove it from the international agenda, he removed it from the Israeli agenda. We went through 5 rounds of elections. Not a single politician talked about the Palestinian issue. No one. And it is the most consequential issue, existential, for Israel to continue to define itself as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people.
Thank you, Gershon. There's some elements of that if time allows, I'd like to come back onto, particularly the question of Salam Fayad. But a question on control. You're against Israel staying in Gaza any longer than the time necessary for Palestinians to take control, you say. And this should happen with or without an international stabilization force in Gaza. You continue.
My preference is for an international stabilization force. My Palestinian partner, who I wrote the article with, is against that. So that was the statement that we compromised on.
Okay. Let's talk about the Palestinian Authority. Because that seems to be the preference of the United States. But what would you say to
Palestinian Authority?
A reformed Palestinian Authority? It's a common refrain, but at the moment quite a vague one in specifics. What would you say to a skeptical Israeli who says that the PA, the unreformed PA at the moment, has not proven itself a force to be trusted with control of Gaza?
Well, I think it's a true statement, but I think it's also largely true because of what Israel has done to the Palestinian Authority and the way that Israel works with the Palestinian Authority. I think it's probably too late to expect the Palestinian Authority to go back to what its potential was during the time of Salam Fayad, when General Dayton, the US general, was working on training Palestinian special forces, and there was the belief that there would be a sharing of intelligence information, and before Israel entered their territories and took action against suspected Palestinians, that the Palestinian Authority police would do that based on Israeli intelligence information or based on its own. That's probably too late for it to happen under its current structure, and there will need to be deep reform in the Palestinian Authority, a restructuring of government, probably moving President Abbas into a position of president for life with the authorities of the Queen of England, rather than being the active president with real power, and having a democratically elected parliament and government who are responsible and accountable to the people. I think that the international community needs to force reform in the educational systems, and here I talk about the Israeli educational system as well. If we're ever going to have a genuine peace process, we're going to need to re-examine what we teach our children and how we teach our children. And I think that each side needs to do an introspective look at their own textbooks and curriculum based on agreed criteria that the international community can help us to set. But I see that as also one of the foundation stones of rebuilding the hope that peace could be genuine. We really need to look at that as a really monumental step forward in understanding that what we teach our children is a reflection of our genuine values. So we need to look at ourselves, and the Palestinians need to look at themselves. Obviously, before the Palestinian Authority can take control of Gaza, they need to go through these reforms. They need to hold elections. You know, the electoral system in Palestine is like the United States in that people have to actually do something active to register to vote, unlike in Israel, where if you're in the population registry, you have the right to vote. In Palestine, when there were supposed to be elections in 2021, 86% of the people who had the right to vote went and registered, and 36 political parties registered to participate in those elections. That's way too many. But it was a festival of democracy that was cut short because Mahmoud Abbas didn't want those elections, and Israel didn't want them, and the United States didn't want them. And they built on the assumption that Israel wouldn't allow the elections to take place in East Jerusalem, when in fact Israel was asked by the Palestinian Authority, and I don't know why they asked, but Israel never even responded. Israel didn't say no, they just never responded. So I think that we need to encourage genuine Palestinian democracy in opening up of the opportunity to young people to participate, particularly young women who are the future of Palestinian society. They are more educated, they are more advanced, they are more progressive than the young men in Palestinian society. And we need to be very careful in them taking over any kind of responsibility that has an impact on the lives and safety of Israelis.
Well, so I mean, since time allows, let's pick up on some elements from the previous couple of answers. Let's go sort of back to front. So in one of your earlier answers, you mentioned that it might be necessary to restrict from running in democratic elections those Palestinian organizations who are committed to the maintenance of a violent struggle.
I didn't say might. I said that it will have to be required.
It will have to be. Okay, so it will have to be. But are you confident that a majority of Palestinians would see such an election restricted under those terms as a free and democratic election?
I think that many Palestinians will. Look, my assessment of Palestinian public opinion, similarly to Israeli public opinion, is that there is basically a 30% hardcore of people in both Israel and in Palestine who oppose to any peace between them, regardless of what it says. Any peace agreement will be voted down by about 30% of Israelis and 30% of Palestinians. The real question that we have to look at is what percentage of that 30% will take to arms to be spoilers and try and kill people in the act of opposing peace. That's the real question that we need to look at. And what are the mechanisms that both sides are going to be required to use in order to prevent them from succeeding like they succeeded in the past? Whether there be violent Jews who want to kill a prime minister to prevent peace, or violent Palestinians who are willing to blow themselves up in buses and cafes to prevent peace. But I think that there's a potential majority of about 70% of Israelis and 70% of Palestinians who actually support the idea of peace and want it to be a fair peace, as just as possible, that will answer as many of the core issues as possible and maintain a possibility of a life of dignity, of freedom, of security, of prosperity. I think those are key issues that we're going to have to look, how do we build them in to a process that gives people genuine hope and no longer empty words that don't mean anything to anyone anymore.
Thank you, Gershon. Again, since time allows, it's a name that our viewers will have heard you mention several times in this discussion, that of Salam Fayad. Fayadism and the sort of political fate of Fayad himself is a source of great regret in the Fathom offices on a regular basis. I wonder perhaps if you could explain for viewers who perhaps aren't quite so familiar what we mean by Fayadism, and having given a very, very thorough sort of accounting of how you think the Israelis failed to engage with that opportunity, perhaps you could also tell viewers the ways in which some elements of internal Palestinian politics also looked that particular gift horse rather in the mouth.
Right, Salam Fayad is a person who earned his PhD in business and economics at the University of Texas in Austin. He worked for many years in the International Monetary Fund. He was brought in he's Palestinian from Jerusalem. He was brought in after being representative of the IMF in Jerusalem to the Palestinian Authority. He was brought in as finance minister first after the death of Arafat when Abu Mazen became prime minister. He was called in by the Americans and the international community to clean up the corruption. He eventually became prime minister. What led to his downfall was actually that he cleaned up the corruption. He closed the faucets to the cronies coming out of the president's office, all the Fatah activists on the ground who were used to getting a lot of money under the table. Fayad not only did that, but he was in the process of forcing people in the refugee camps to actually pay for water and electricity. And that's actually what led to his demise and his downfall and being kicked out of the office, because he was very unpopular with people who had gotten free electricity and free water for many, many years and suddenly were being demanded to pay for them. When he was forced to give discounts, people who had been paying for water and electricity all these years were saying, why are these people getting discounts when we have to pay the full price all the time? So there were a lot of issues involved. He eventually left the office. He returned to the United States. He's a professor at the University of Princeton in New Jersey. There are a lot of people who talk about him coming back. He was pragmatic. He brought Palestinian institution building to the point where they were ready for statehood. He was creating the actual Palestinian state with the support of the international community, and he understood the responsibilities. Unfortunately, he had to deal with a prime minister who didn't want to see a Palestinian state, and that was Netanyahu. And Netanyahu did everything that he does to foil the chances of there being a Palestinian state. And he worked overtime to delegitimize Fayad as well. And that was a great loss to the Palestinians and to the Israeli people. There are many people, particularly in the United States, who talk about Fayad coming back. I don't know if it's possible because he's not very popular on the ground. He is popular amongst most of the foreign donor countries. I don't know who will take over. A name that's popped up a lot lately is Nasser El-Kidwa. Nasser was the PLO representative in the UN for about 20 years. He was a former Palestinian foreign minister. He is the nephew of Yasser Arafat, which gives him a certain amount of name recognition and legitimacy. His mother was Arafat's sister. He is an international lawyer and respected internationally. He spends most of his time in Nice. His wife is French, but he spends time in Cairo. And about a year ago, he went back to Gaza and he opened up Arafat's house and started working out of Arafat's house. And his name has come up quite a bit as a possible temporary administrator in Gaza until they hold elections.
Thank you, Gershon. Let's take one more question, which concerns the US. In the article, you and your co-author wrote, quote, that it is in President Biden's hands to decide whether he will be the American president that signed the birth certificate of the two-state solution, granting Israelis and Palestinians peace, security, justice, rights, and prosperity. This idea that Biden has the two-state solution in the palm of his hand might surprise some. What do you mean? What did you mean by it, and how might you respond to those who said that the US has tried many times to implement such a solution and has always failed? Why is it different now?
Well, because the US never recognized the state of Palestine. The US, when the state of Palestine became a non-member state of the United Nations, supported by 138 countries in the General Assembly, they had originally tried to gain membership in the UN through the Security Council, and the United States told the Palestinians that they would veto it. So there's no possibility for the Palestinians to seek full membership as a member state of the United Nations. There are two time clocks that we're facing right now. One is the war clock, how much time Israel has to finish the job. And the other clock of importance is Biden's political clock, which is running now at a rapid rate as he's facing next November's elections. He is losing the support within his own party. The demographics of the Democratic Party, the young people, the minorities, are not supporting Israel in this war and are not supporting the United States and see the United States as compliant with Israel in killing the Palestinians in Gaza. I claim that Biden has a chance of regaining support of the young people and minorities in the party should he lead the international community in the recognition of the state of Palestine in a two-state solution. This is his way of maybe staying president of the United States. Otherwise, he's going to be faced with the reality that a lot of people in the Democratic Party are not going to vote for Trump. They're simply not going to vote. And he will lose key states because of that. So he has his own political interest in doing the right thing now, as well as I think in the interest of Israel and of course the Palestinians in ceasing the 30 years of making statements about a two-state solution and finally addressing it sincerely and genuinely by recognizing the state of Palestine.
So just to be clear on that, you think that Biden could regain, not retain, that support, while simultaneously but supporting Israel in a war which you earlier on described as a war of no choice, and alongside that moving towards recognition of Palestinian statehood. You think he can do both things?
Well, I think that we're looking at a more of a post-war scenario with the hope that Israel will be able to complete the job of dismantling Hamas's ability to continue to control Gaza. But the Americans, I know, are doing a lot more work on the day after the war, thinking about the day after the war than the Israelis are.
Yeah,
we need to be doing that thinking. We need to be doing the planning. We need to be doing it together with Israelis and Palestinians. I've been invited to numerous discussions of Israelis talking about the day after, and my response to all of them is that it's boring. If we're talking to ourselves in a closed room, it's a boring discussion. It's irrelevant. We need to be talking to the Palestinians. We need to be talking to the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Saudis and the Emiratis, as well as the Americans and the Europeans. We can't do this discussion in an echo chamber of sitting around the room, a bunch of Israeli generals talking to ourselves. This is a much wider discussion, and I hope that I know that the Americans are talking in a wider circle, but we Israelis need to be engaging others in the region and around the world in the day after scenarios that promise us that we won't stay in Gaza. Because I remind everyone, in 1982, when we went into southern Lebanon, the Shiite villagers in the south of Lebanon threw rice and candies at our soldiers, and 3 or 4 months later were planting roadside bombs against them. We cannot stay in Gaza. That is an explosive boomerang, and God forbid someone should even think about rebuilding settlements there. This is something that we cannot do. And we need to also remove from the discussion the fantasy that we can push 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza. That's a destruction of a peace treaty with Egypt and with Jordan, and a strategic era of unimaginable proportions to the future of the state of Israel. They're going to stay in Gaza, and we need to deal with the destruction that we have done in Gaza with 2 million people today who are homeless. And so the rebuilding, reconstruction effort is something that we need to take seriously. And just as a tip to leave before we close the discussion, I think that Israel should open up the Kerem Shalom crossing point now and start its own international humanitarian aid facility, because the UN is doing a terrible job of it. And Israel should be saying to the civilian population in Gaza, we're not against you, we're against Hamas. And here we're opening up this crossing point. We're allowing trucks to come in. We will help to distribute food. We pushed 1 million people into the southwest corner of Gaza. We're going to deliver aid trucks directly there, followed by Israeli army vehicles that are going to protect them and make sure that Hamas doesn't steal the water and the food and the flour and the things that need to get there. This is how Israel should be responding today to the humanitarian disaster that we have helped to create.
Gershon Baskin, each one of the questions that we've asked and each one of the answers you've given could quite easily justify a sort of 2-hour follow-up on each one. So as Alan said earlier on, I do hope you're open to coming back to elaborate on some of these issues. In the meantime, thank you very, very much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.